So next we'll welcome David Litva on his paper, Redating Simon's Great Declaration.
This is a kind of preview of my forthcoming book on Simon of Samaria, as I call him, aka Simon Magus, but I try to convince you that's not how we should call him. I'll begin with a quotation from the Great Declaration. This is the letter of declaration, of voice and of name from the thought of the great and invisible power. Thus it will be sealed, hidden, veiled, and stored in the dwelling in which the root of the universe is established. This comes from the Refutation of All Heresies, which was published approximately 222, shortly after the bishopric of Callistus in Rome. And I want to argue this morning that this is the single document that has claim to being a distinctly Simonian source, preserved in its original language. This title, the Great Declaration, is attested by the Refutator, as I call him, yet the actual name of the work could well have been the Declaration of the Great Power. This declaration has been understudied in recent years, due in part to the view that it is late and derivative. Some modern treatments of Simon and Simonians fail to mention the declaration at all. Even if scholars take it into account, they tend to subordinate it to heresiological reports coming from Justin, Irenaeus, and so on. This is problematic in my view, given that the declaration is, as I will argue, a better source for understanding earlier forms of Simonian thought. Since the declaration is embedded in the refutation, it's necessary to examine the refutator's sources and method. Joseph Frickel believed that the refutator did not have the actual declaration, but a paraphrase of it. His views are based on the theory that the refutator mechanically copied out his sources. This theory has been recently refuted, so only a brief response to Frickel is now required. The frequent use of he says or face seen in the Simon report is most likely the work of the refutator. Its use is not systematic, indicating, as Frickel argued, distinct paragraph divisions. It is, as it usually functions in ancient literature, a device used to signal reported speech. Explicit quotes from the declaration seem apparent only at the beginning and the end of the report. Overall, the refutator seems to have paraphrased himself the other selections from the declaration, which is why the content sometimes seems choppy and incomplete. The refutator may have preserved only a fraction of the declaration, and he did not necessarily excerpt the text in order. And, as is well known, he also sprinkled in several of his own sardonic comments and interjections. From the excerpts we have, we can determine that the heart of the declaration from the Refutation, Book 6, 12 to 17, is an allegorical reading of Genesis 1 to 3, a type of treatise called a hexameron. A hexameron, most simply defined, is a work commenting on the 6 or sometimes 7 days of creation, incorporating contemporaneous scientific and medical lore to create a picture of the divine and human worlds. In this hexameron, the various creations in Genesis 1 signify paired powers. Heaven and earth represent mind and thought, here epimia. Sun and moon are voice and name, while air and water symbolize reasoning and conception. These powers are summed up in the 7th power, a name for wisdom who appears in the Hebrew Scriptures. The refutator, who attacks Simon's disciples, occasionally introduced these excerpts with fasim, or they say. The they, in my view, does not necessarily indicate group authorship of the declaration. It rather represents the refutator's struggle against a global category of Simonians, all of whom putatively asserted the material of the Declaration. The refutator more often introduced his excerpts with "Simon says," or the like. Simon, however, never introduces himself in what survives. There was apparently some textual clue, perhaps a subtitle or epigraph of some sort, that generated the refutator's unwavering conviction that Simon himself spoke the Declaration. This is not the sort of data the refutator would invent, in my view. After all, the refutator would not have intuited that the Declaration was Simonian at all, based on knowledge of previous heresiology. The content is strikingly distinct. Some scholars have proposed that Simon wrote the original form of the Declaration. Others have argued that its philosophical sophistication indicates a later author and date. The latter argument is flawed, however, since Simon could well have been philosophically inclined, and the eclectic philosophy of the work, which includes bits of Plato, Aristotle, Empedocles, and others, obviously predates Simon. The only conclusive way to exclude Simon's authorship is to show that the Declaration came after his lifetime. The author of the Declaration, whom I will simply call the Declarator, alluded to the Gospel of Matthew or a form of Luke, both of which were not likely written prior to 80 of the Common Era. I think it's arbitrary to exclude New Testament citations as later additions. The quotations are extremely well integrated into the text. Accordingly, the Declaration cannot have been written prior to about 85. The upper dating limit is provided by the Nicene preacher. This preacher was a versatile and cosmopolitan Christian theologian whose daring discourse was excerpted in the Refutation, Book 5. The preacher quoted from a variety of sources, one of them being the Declaration, to quote from the Refutation, Book 5.9.5. Moreover, this, he claims, is the speech of God, which, he says, is the speech of declaration of the great power. Thus it will be sealed, hidden, and veiled, lying in the dwelling where the root of the universe is established. This first sentence of the Nicene quote is a paraphrase with a citation marker, he says, of what we find in the Declaration. And the second sentence is a direct quotation, agreeing verbatim with the 14-word chain of the Declaration. At least one scholar has authored that the refutator inserted these lines of the Declaration into the Nicene report, yet in Book 5, the refutator had not arrived at his exposition of the Declaration, and turning to a different source conflicts with his usual method, proceeding from one document before turning to the next. I grant that the refutator often blended his reports by adding elements and phrases employed from memory, yet this sort of conflation is different from quoting verbatim a 14-word chain. The refutator had no compelling reason to quote the Declaration as the capstone of the Nicene preacher's commentary on a hymn to Attis. The preacher himself, however, was inclined to cite other sources. He mentions the Gospel according to the Egyptians. The preacher also made use of the Declaration later in the discourse when he allegorized the rivers of paradise. So, in my view, whoever wrote the Nicene sermon, as it's called, had access to the Great Declaration. When did this author write? Dating him is a challenge, but signs point to a period late in the 2nd century. Mainly, this is because the Nicene preacher combined elements of Ophite theology, God as human and child of human, with a Valentinian theory of tripartite humanity. Only someone later in the 2nd century, I think, could have interwoven these originally independent strands. The tripartite theory of humanity was fully developed, it seems, by the time Heraclian wrote his commentary on John, which I would put around 175. Thus, we could probably assign the Nicene Discourse a date sometime between 180 and 210. The Declaration, accordingly, can be dated anywhere between about 85 and 200 of the Common Era. But there are indications that the Declaration appeared earlier than 200. First of all, its author seems not to have known the Gospel according to John. The notion that Simon, along with all humans, was born from the mixing of bloodlines, as the author says, may be considered an allusion to John 1:13. Yet this phrase, from bloodlines, is fairly common in ancient Greek, and one cannot establish a secure connection. It's interesting that the author of the Declaration refers to the Logos to refer to Scripture and to Moses specifically. For an author to identify Moses with the Logos would be surprising if he or she had knowledge of John 1:1. The zero engagement with John, I think, may indicate a earlier date, since by the mid-2nd century, it seems John, both among proto-Orthodox and so-called Gnostics, was a commonly recognized authority among virtually all Christian writers, and those who knew the other Gospels, such as Matthew and Luke, often employed John as well. But there's another piece of evidence signaling an early date for the Declaration, namely its failure to mention Helen. Anyone who knows the Simonian reports from Justin and Irenaeus knows how central Helen was to later Simonian theology. Helen represents Simon's primal Enia, not Apenia. She was the incarnation of the creatrix who made the angels, but was later abused and forced into human bodies. Her absence from the Declaration is striking because its author was clearly familiar with a figure he called thought, which is always Apenia. The Declarator called Apenia the seventh power, represented by the seventh day of creation. She is also identified with the Spirit hovering over the waters in Genesis 1:2. Humans are made in the image of this Apenia, and she is clearly a central figure, but she is never once identified with Helen, who is never named. In his addendum to the Declaration, of course, the refutator was eager to add Helen, but here he filled in material from Irenaeus. We have reason to believe, moreover, that the Helen tradition was introduced by Justin, Irenaeus, and the refutator in order simply to defame Simon, since Helen was vilified as a former sex worker. The third indication of the Declaration's early date is its failure to identify Simon with the great power. Simon is the great power, interpreted as the highest power, became a stable part of the heresiological tradition by the late 2nd century CE. Not once, however, does the author of the Declaration call Simon the great power. Instead, he creates a narrative world in which all people can become one with the being called, or he calls, infinite power, when they are fully conformed to God's image. Simon is never singled out as the one who becomes this power, infinite or great or what have you. Indeed, when one reads the Declaration, apart from the framework and presuppositions of the refutator, there is nothing special about Simon at all. If we believe the refutator, Simon merely spoke the Declaration. He's not in it. Of course, this theory can be reversed, but we have to ask what's more likely, that the declarator completely masked two staple elements of later Simonian theology, Simon as the great power and Helen as thought, or that he was not yet familiar with these ideas. In my view, once the proclaimer, namely Simon, became the proclaimed, the great power, there was no turning back. Simon as the great power and Helen as thought became the foundations of later Simonian theology, and an author, Simonian or otherwise, was not at liberty to ignore them by the late 2nd century. In sum, these three pieces of evidence, no knowledge of John, the absence of Helen, and the failure to identify Simon with the great power, support a date of the Declaration prior to 150. The reports of Justin, which is about 150, and Irenaeus, about 180, would then represent later stages of Simonian thought, when Helen was a major figure, and when the great power title was said to have been claimed by Simon himself. Since the declarator knew the Gospel of Matthew or a form of Luke, then we can propose a date range between 85 and 150. Can we be still more precise? I think perhaps we can, if we focus on the declarator's knowledge of medicine. The declarator's allegorical interpretation of Eden reveals a detailed knowledge of embryology. He knew that in the womb, breath, pneuma, passed from mother to child through the umbilical cord. This point was already known in the Hippocratic tradition, yet this tradition seems to have asserted that the embryo could breathe through its mouth and nose, a point that the declarator denies, quote, "For the fetus neither receives food through the mouth nor breathes it through the nostrils. The fetus is entirely bundled in what is called the amniotic membrane and is nourished through the umbilical cord," unquote. As it turns out, the medical writer Soranus, who flourished between about 100 and 130 of the Common Era, made the same 2 points in exactly the same order. To quote from his Gynecology, quote, "The majority say that, in addition, the embryo possesses another membrane called amniotic, And beside it, they say fluid cannot be drawn in through the mouth since respiration takes place through the umbilical cord, unquote. I think this linguistic parallel is fairly close. Perhaps this is not surprising, since this teaching, as Soranus notes, was known to the majority of medical writers by the early 2nd century. There is, however, a lengthier parallel between the Declarator and Soranus, one that is worth quoting in full from Soranus, quote, "From the fleshier parts and from the parts along the upper uterus, there extends from above a thin organ which naturally merges into the midsection of the embryos, called the epigastrium, the region of the umbilical cord. And when this organ grows into the embryo, it's called the umbilical cord. It's divided into 4 vessels, 2 venal and 2 arterial. Through these, the material of blood and breath are conveyed to nourish the embryos." I'll just quote from a section of the Declaration, quote, "For on each side of the umbilical cord 2 arteries are extended, which serve as channels of breath, and 2 veins, which serve as channels of blood." Now he says that when the umbilical cord flows from Eden, it is organically joined with the fetus at the epigastrium, which all commonly call the umbilical cord. I'm not arguing that these are a direct quotation of Soranus, but I do think that these 2 passages indicate at least a common knowledge that in the early imperial period, the umbilical cord was made up of 4 vessels, 2 veins and 2 arteries that circulated blood and breath respectively. It is the case that the order and the discussion, as well as the technical vocabulary in both passages, indicate that perhaps Soranus, or perhaps Soranus' source, which might have been the midwifery of Herophilus, might be in the background of the Declarator. At any rate, we know that Soranus became a well-known writer in the early to mid-2nd century, that he was located in Alexandria and then Rome. It is possible that if the Declarator is knowing Soranus or his source, that he was writing probably after 120. Therefore, I would hypothetically date the declaration between 120 and 150. This range, of course, makes it impossible for Simon to be the author. Even if one rejects dependence on Soranus, the gospel quotations still indicate a date after 85. Of course, I think Simon was well dead by then. One can then attribute the declaration to an early 2nd century Simonian, it seems, who wrote in Simon's own voice, or at least attributed the work to Simon. Now, I have a section on provenance, which I'm going to go through rather quickly. I have some time. Mm-hmm. Okay. We gather from the Suda that Soranus studied in Alexandria in the reigns of Trajan and Hadrian. We do not know when he wrote his gynecology, but it was presumably in the early 2nd century. The Simonian author would have immediate access to this material in Alexandria or Rome. We know that the refutator knew the declaration by about 220, but the Nicene preacher had the declaration even earlier. And as I've argued in my book, now in the exhibit, the Nicene preacher was writing in Alexandria. Furthermore, the declaration seems to present a metaphysics that was associated with the 1st century BCE Platonist uterus of Alexandria. According to this metaphysics, an unknown and unknowable first principle emanates 2 opposite principles called monad and dyad. Uterus seems to have been the first to place a transcendent one above this pair. The monad he calls, quote, ordered, determined, knowable, and male, whereas the dyad he calls, quote, disordered, undetermined, unknowable, and female, unquote. We can compare this teaching with the declaration, quote, there are 2 offshoots of all the aeons, having neither beginning nor end. They are from a single root. One of these is the mind of the universe, which is male. The other is below, which is thought, female, magnificent, who generates all things. Although the terminology is different, there is a similar structure of a one or root principle, which gives birth or emanates to a monad and a dyad pair, which are coded as male and female. It's this structure of the transcendent one above the monad and dyad that is distinctly Eudorian, and this is the pattern that appears in the declaration. By the time one comes to Numenius in the mid-2nd century, the philosophical language has changed. Additional evidence for the Alexandrian provenance is Clement's familiarity with the Simonians. Quote, "The Simonians," he said, "aim to be exactly conformed, ex homoi ustai, to the standing one," unquote. Significantly, Clement did not identify Simon with the standing one, and this point conforms with what we find in the Declaration. And his particular word that he uses here, ex homoiustai, is very close in terms of its conceptuality with the declarator's term ex ekonitzo, which speaks of the Simonians' exact confirmation to God. This particular word is used 9 times in the Declaration, and in each case it refers to the assimilation to God, who is called the one who stood, stands, and will stand. It's also worth noting that Celsus, in the 160s and 170s, was familiar with, quote, Simonians and Hellenians. Many scholars have argued that Celsus wrote in Egypt, or at least sojourned there for a time, and I have argued for Celsus's Alexandrian provenance elsewhere. It's finally relevant that the declarator quotes the Book of Wisdom, widely credited with an Alexandrian provenance. Wisdom, according to Simon, is a spirit, an image from an incorruptible form, alone ordering everything. And as wisdom appears in the book Wisdom of Solomon, she is a spirit, image of God's goodness, who is alone administering all things. So, to sum up, the declarator was probably a devotee of Simon, who produced the Simonian writing in Egypt between 120 and 150 of the Common Era. My dating is based on 1, the absence of John's Gospel, 2, the missing Helen, 3, the lack of identification of Simon with the great power, and 4, resemblance to Eudoran Middle Platonism prior to Numenian modifications. If I'm right about this dating and the provenance, which are hypotheses, the Declaration represents a stage of Simonian thought prior to what we find in Acts 8:10, where Simon himself is deified by, quote, all Samaritans as the great power. The relatively early date of the Declaration, which likely appeared before Justin's first apology, emphasizes its importance as a source for the earliest recoverable Simonian thought. Obviously, the Declaration is not a traditional heresiological report. It is rather a fairly detailed, selective and paraphrased account of an early 2nd century Simonian's thought. Thus, the Declaration should take priority when it comes to reconstructing the earliest recoverable Simonian theology. Thank you very much.
Questions or comments for David?
I've convinced everyone.
And her. Yes.
That the use of medical science is an interesting thing, and maybe that could be extended to other texts in Agamadi that reflect that particular fashion, because medical knowledge and embryology and so on became a fashion, but at a certain time in the 2nd century. But that period is more likely to be the second half of the 2nd century than the first half. So that even though Soranus myself may have written his texts at the beginning of that century, it doesn't mean that they were actually read immediately. But if you look into the trend of looking to medical knowledge and flaunting knowledge of medical things, then you could situate this text in as part of this cultural movement, as it were.
Yeah, I think we need to think regionally and geographically. I think the vanguard of Christian theology is in Alexandria in the early 2nd century. Our first known speculative Christian theologians are Basilides and Carpocrates and Valentinus, who of course moves to Rome. But that's the area where, unlike all other areas at that time, and they're dated by Clement to the reign of Hadrian, they're doing serious theological work and seemingly interacting with a whole range of other sources, which I think would include medical sources. So it is true, I think, eventually other Christians in other areas catch up, as it were. But I think that Alexandria is quite distinctive for that range of interaction with other sources at a fairly early period. Now, I know that, we have only Basilides and Carpocrates. Well, we have Basilides in fragments. We have Epiphanies in fragments. But they are engaged highly with other types of Greco-Roman literature. And so that's why it's not a smoking gun argument, of course. But it's why I also prefer Alexandria. And I'll just note that Tertullian makes use of Serranus, but of course he's later. So that would, of course, support your view.
Yes.
I'm convinced. So it's only a question concerning, I don't know how to label the stratum before the first stratum. That's the question concerning the Samaritan color, all these Kippenberg arguments. If this stratum you have reconstructed as the first stratum is an Alexandrine stratum, and it's quite interesting also, Valentinus has this interest in medical questions, how to eat and what follows. So there is obviously common interest, as Einar said, but what about the Samaritan color of science?
I think that is a scholarly myth. And in fact, it's interesting, Clemens Schulten has an article on where was Simon born, where did he originate? And he makes the argument that Simon was not born in Samaria, but in Idumea. And so we find Simon in Samaria, the first connection to Samaria in Acts. And as some of you have probably gathered, I date Acts late. So maybe you disagree with me there, but I would put Acts about 130, possibly slightly even later. But regardless of that question, the connection of Simon with Samaria, I think, is later. There's nothing distinctly Samaritan about Simon. If there was something Samaritan about Simon, we would expect that he had knowledge of the Samaritan Pentateuch, that he had knowledge of Samaritan holidays, or that he practiced Samaritan holidays, that he venerated Mount Gerizim. We find absolutely none of that until the Pseudo-Clementines. So this idea of Simon being a Samaritan, first of all, I think it's based on a mistranslation. I mean, it's unfortunate that in English, he has been translated not Simon of Samaria, but Simon the Samaritan. And I think that's a mistranslation. All we have is Samarius, and I mean in the Greek. And so, I mean, you can pick which translation you want, but there's not a shred of evidence that he had any distinct knowledge of Samaritan ritual or customs. So I think that argument basically fails. And you fall into a heresiological trap, because later heresiologists might have wanted to peg him as somehow associated with Samaritan religion. I think that's definitely demonstrable in the Pseudo-Clementines. And the reason they do that is because Samaritan was always the other to Judaism. And so you can further other Simon and push him into the periphery, into the margin, by portraying him as coming out of Samaritanism. But there's no early evidence that he practiced Samaritanism as a religion. Yeah.
David, thanks so much for the paper. The dating of the provenance that you're proposing put him as, or put this text roughly contemporary with Menander and Basilides. How do you see it interrelating with other things that are kind of circulating in the time period and region?
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. So there's no evil creator. So in my book on Simon, at least I'll try to convince you that there's nothing Gnostic about the Great Declaration. It's a hexameron. it's maybe our first hexameron. I mean, it looks most like Philo and Philonic, to be honest, because Philo, if you look, he has these same allegories of heaven and earth, and he allegorizes other elements of Genesis 1. He's got different names for them, but I mean, it's very similar to what the Declarator is doing. I don't see a huge connection with Menander, who's in Antioch, and I wouldn't expect one. Basilides is interesting. I mean, people mention, at least in the heresiological tradition, that Basilides believed in aeons. We certainly have aeonic-like things in the Declaration. We know that Basilides quotes from the book of Genesis, particularly on Abraham, Genesis 12:1. That's in a Basilidian fragment. We know that Basilides is engaging with all sorts of literature, philosophic, so that would at least fit the profile of someone who is a very serious speculative theologian who is doing very serious speculative work. So I mean, I don't have any smoking gun connection with Basilides, but I do think that there's a kind of Alexandrian cultural resonance in both texts, and this is just the best hypothesis, folks. I mean, I'm giving you nothing but a hypothesis and nothing but a reconstruction, but I think it's the best one.
Thank you, David.
Thanks.